Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 3 of our coverage of the 2018 Canada's tournament from Berlin, Germany. Our competitors today, White's going to be played by Levon Aronian, has 2 draws coming into round 3, so he's half a point behind first place. He is trailing his opponent today, Vladimir Kramnik, playing the black pieces. He is in tie for first after having a win in a tie after his first 2 rounds. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Starts out with pawn to e4. Pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, getting into the Lopez. But instead of yesterday where we saw pawn to a6 and we transition into the closed game, we immediately get into the Berlin defense, which is the most common Lopez variation that we seem to have been seeing over the past 3 or so years. And we see Vladimir play pawn to d3. Now, this is not the most common. Castling on the king side is definitely the most common, but decides to go ahead and play pawn to d3. Now, bishop down to c5. Bishop takes, pawn recaptures, and then castle on the king side. Queen to e7, and this does a couple things. One is it protects this bishop here on c5, but it also allows for black to have the option if he wants to castle on the queen side. Anytime there is the exchange in the Lopez where the pawn recaptures here on c6, it's one of the few times you'll see black capture away from the center. Many times when you capture with your pawns, you're capturing towards the center instead of away if you have the option. This is one of the times where you'll normally see black capturing away so they can have the option of castling on the queen side, having their rook here on d8 as a semi-open file, really attacking their opponent. So this queen to e7, it is a developing move, also just kind of waits to see where his opponent does play. And Aronian plays pawn to h3. This does stop the bishop coming down here to g4, pinning down the knight and then castling on the queen side, start to have a strong attack, pushing everything on the king side of the board. So it does stop that threat. Also, knight down to g4 is just pretty annoying. But we see a pretty interesting move from Vladimir Kramnik, and he completely goes on the offensive, and he plays rook here to g8, getting ready to push forward if he wants to with his pawns, definitely signaling that if he wants to castle, it is going to be on the queen side of the board, giving up to right to do that on the king side of the board. We do see king to h1, which is fairly interesting to see Levon Aronian already kind of curious about how he's going to defend this. Does not want to have to worry about this bishop here on c5, pinning down the pawn on f2. Also with the rook here on the g file, just doesn't want to have to worry about his king. But he's sort of in retreat mode already. He's not developing his other pieces, where black really developing a lot of his pieces on the board. Now knight to h5, this opens up the door for the queen to get involved into the game if he ever needs to, as well as opens up the door for a strong attack, pushing forward with pawn to g5. Now pawn to c3, getting ready for a push, but really this is just a preparation move for a later move like pawn to d4. Doesn't really immediately get pieces involved into the game or strike the center and force black to respond. So we see Vladimir Kramnik continue with his game plan, and that's pawn to g5. Stay as aggressive as possible in the game. He feels like he has a strong attack going on, even though it's very early on, 9 moves into the Lopez. We don't see this very often in the Berlin defense. Usually more of a quiet defense where black just has a very solid structure, doesn't really try to advance too much, just wait to see what white does. All of a sudden, 9 moves in the Berlin defense, Vladimir Kramnik is gone on the offensive. Now in this position, we see white take the pawn here on e5. And this is one of those squares, I think you should probably look at this position and recognize that there's no way that Vladimir Kramnik is going to just give up this pawn unless there is a very, very strong attack. And if there is, probably should be thinking about something else. After the knight takes, not really sure what he's expecting. Clearly not going to, take the knight here on e5 because then just the queen takes here on h5. This gets rid of the biggest threat that black has going on, and now all of a sudden we see white is up material. That's not going to happen on board. What we do see is black says, yeah, you can have that pawn. I'm not worried about the pawn right now. I'm focused on the big attack. And he plays pawn to g4, really trying to blow up this king side of the board and all the protection in front of the king. And it's kind of tough right now. Where does black go from here? How does he respond if we look at it and say, okay, what if the knight were to take here on g4? Well, now we could say just the bishop takes, and then how does white respond? If he takes with his pawn, okay, then the queen comes down here to h4, and this is going to be a quick mate. Knight down here to g3. This pawn can't recapture because it's being pinned down by the bishop here. Okay, what if instead of the pawn taking there, what if the queen takes? We can clearly see the queen is going to fall after the rook takes, maybe pawn to d4, attacking the bishop. So both the bishop and the rook are being captured. But then black can just continue to sacrifice material. Rook takes on g2, king recaptures, and now the queen down here, e4 check, starting to gobble up more material. And then later, if he wants to, pawn to f3, queen down here, c2. Eventually, we see castle on the queen side. Black is able to get the queen or the rook involved into the game. Have a come back. A few other options because people are always curious what other things we could see. The bishop now is attacking this queen, so maybe queen to d2. Let's put it on this dark square so it's no longer being attacked right now. But now the bishop could just take here on h3. We've already looked at what happens if the pawn were to take. Well, that gets very difficult. You could get the queen involved into the game. The rook can easily get involved into the game. And you always have that knight coming down at any point here to g3 check, forcing white to do something. That's not going to be a good option. Another option from here, we could see maybe pawn to g3, just trying something new. But now rook takes on g3, could sacrifice pawn takes, knight takes here. This is forking, but could decide just not even going to worry about taking that rook since black has such a strong attack. You can see there's just no great moves in the game if the knight were to take. So we do see Levon Aronian does not do that, and instead, after pawn to g4, he does play pawn to d4, trying to just break up some of the attack that Vladimir Kramnik has in the game. But you can see it's so difficult with so much material aimed at the king side of the board. Now we see black play bishop here to d6, and then g3. Do not want to go ahead and take here on g4. So we talked about queen down h4. That's going to be extremely bad. So we see pawn up here to g3. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and the queen takes here on e5. This is setting up for whenever black wants to take this pawn on e4, and that would also be check. So white has to deal with it. Plays queen up here to d4. Says, please exchange material. I think I can get down to an endgame, hopefully draw the game out. Vladimir Kramnik recognizes he does not want to give up his strongest piece when he has a super strong attack. So he's going to retreat, bring his queen back here to e7. Very important square because it also still allows him to come to that critical square of h4. If there ever is some exchange here on g4, coming down here to h4 is just a huge threat. So we see pawn to h4, pawn to c5 from Vladimir Kramnik attacking the queen. Queen comes here to c4, and then bishop to e6. So just centralizing this bishop. Now it's go time if black ever wants to castle on the queen side of the board. Queen up here to a b5 check, sure. Pawn to c6, and the queen comes back here to a4. And this is where I think the queen really needs to be more centralized. Queen to d3 makes some sense. I mean, white's in a tough position either way, but queen to a4 really takes the queen out of the equation here. This is the strongest piece. Both the rook here on a1, the queen here on a4 aren't doing anything. This knight, the only way it can really get involved into the game is to come here to d2. That's going to block off the dark square bishop. So it just feels like Levon Aronian has blocked himself out of the game. Pawn to f4, so let's just throw everything we can at the opponent's king side. And, would really like to just play pawn takes on f5, because then the queen is open to get involved into the game. But this is going to be bad. Knight takes on g3. If the king comes up here, Queen down to h4. You know, if the pawn takes, could have taken before. Either way, then the queen could come here. But the bishop to d5 check. You can see how bad this gets. Queen down here to h2. There's just no way for white to really deal with this. So was not able to take this pawn as he would like to. Plays bishop up here to g5, attacking the queen. Rook takes, pawn recaptures. Push those pawns as much as possible. Continue to put pressure on your opponent. The queen comes back to d1, recognizing that it needs to get involved into the game. Was not doing anything there on a4. Rook to d8 says, okay, you're on d1. I want to get my rook involved into the game. I can't castle because you can't castle through a check. So just says, yeah, rook over here to d8. My king here on e8 is completely safe. There's no way you can get material up. The only piece you would actually attack with is your queen, and you really need to keep that at home base to try to protect the action. Queen here to c1, trying to attack some of this material, but Vladimir Kramnik decides, let's just go and blow up some material here. And you know, if the pawn takes, okay, well, that's going to be bad. We already know that the knight's going to come down here to g3, forking the rook, just gobbling up more material. And then Levon Aronian plays knight to a3. Not necessarily a bad move. He needs to get his other rook involved into the game. Also needs to find a great square for his knight, and he can't bring it to c3. If he brings it here to d2, that's just blocking off his queen. But you can really tell what desperation mode Levon Aronian's in. Vladimir Kramnik completely crushing the king side of the board, has a strong attack going on, and he's playing knight over here to a3, completely away from the action, not threatening his opponent in any way, shape, or form. It's not looking good for the white. Black comes down to d3, and then we see rook to d1, just trying to exchange material. Vladimir Kramnik's not having it. He finds a really nice move here. It's the best move on the board and really just ends things. You know, Levon Aronian does end up playing a few more moves, but feel free to stop it. See if you can find the best move for black in this position. And the move is bishop to d5, and it opens up so many attacks on the board. We'll go through some of them. If we look and say, okay, what happens if the pawn takes? Okay, pawn takes here on d5, but once the bishop came here from e6, that did open up the door for the queen to activate queen down here to e4. Maybe king g1, pawn takes. That's a deadly check right there. It doesn't really matter if it takes or not. It's all going to be downhill. Knight to g3 check. If the king takes, sure, it's all going to look the same. Queen down here to f3. There will eventually be a checkmate in the game. That's not going to do it, although it looks like, oh yeah, you have that piece of material here. I'll go ahead and take that. Can't take that bishop. He tries for pawn to f3, recognizing, you know, that pawn taking here is just a devastating move, so doesn't want to deal with that, but this fails as well. Pawn takes here on f3. Now the pawn could take on d5. Doesn't have to worry about the same mate, but he still has to worry about mate. Queen down here to e2. There's no way to really stop this. You can see the queen coming over here to h2 is checkmate. So we see white play rook to e1, and this says you can't move your queen because it's being pinned down. So we see Vladimir Kramnik say, yeah, no problem. I'll play pawn to g2. And now there's just no good move that white has here. He has both of his pawns. Depending on where white moves, he can eventually get his knight involved into the game. He can push his pawn one more, then get his rook involved into the game. It's all going to be very, very bad for white. So at the end of the day, Levon Aronian decides to resign. Vladimir Kramnik, to the first 3 games, has 2 victories and a draw. So he is atop of the leaderboard. Congratulations to him. Playing the Berlin offense, I just don't expect to see someone playing it this aggressive. But he had a game plan. He executed, and from the very beginning, he was all over his opponent and never let up, attacked the entire game, and just completely overwhelmed Levon Aronian. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. We are going to be taking a break. The players play three matches and then take a day off. So the next day will be a break, and then we'll come back for round number 4. But thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.